Pocky and Rocky. This was a Super Nintendo game I think I saw in like a public access TV show way back in the day. I never got a chance to play it though. I always wanted to. And now I got a chance, and I'm very thankful for that because this has been one I wanted to kick off my bucket list, so to speak. Despite its name, it's actually the second part in a 4-part series. Although we never got the original game, Kiki Kai Kai. I believe that was relegated to the arcades and PC Engine in Japan, although we did get it on one of the Taito Legends games. I believe the second one. I actually own that, I should take a look. But don't worry. If you never played the original Kiki Kai Kai, the story itself actually goes back and regales you on the facts. The story follows Pockleford Q Shrine Maidenington, henceforth referred to as Pocky. She was on a quest to save the 7 lucky gods and their magic treasure ship from the evil Nopino goblins and their horrible master, Rockefeller R. Raccoon, henceforth known as Rocky, who were a series of mischievous monsters who, tried to ruin the gods' day, I guess, and make the world just in general unlucky. But fortunately, Pocky saved the day, and that's all you get from the story from the original game in here, which, to be fair, is fairly accurate, although they conveniently ignore the fact she did a lot of really dumb, arbitrary nonsense after the final boss to get to the actual ending of the game, because it was an early Taito arcade game. Here's looking at you, Rainbow Islands, with all your terrible, arbitrary nonsense as well. But now, Rocky has come to Pocky with a problem. His goblin friends are acting funny, and he needs her help to figure out why and to save the day. I do appreciate that they go back and tell you the actual story of the original game, even if they ignore the crucial bits about how she had to actively exercise these magical lanterns in a specific order after the final boss, or else she actually failed the main game. I have no idea why Taito did that. But for what little story from the original game you get, it was quite good. And what story you get here isn't much, but there are a couple of twists and turns in the plot itself, and it is relatively serviceable for the type of game this is. There is one thing I noticed while playing this game that seemed a little bit weird to me, and maybe this is just me digging a little bit deeper into this than I should and overthinking things, but there's kind of a weird subtext to this game, a little bit. Spoilers for later on in the game, but Rocky's Nopino goblin friends are under the control of a completely different, legally distinct group of goblins known as the Gorgonzola goblins, and when you go and fight them, you notice that they kind of have a completely different design to them. Whereas, the goblins that we've been fighting up to this point are like the classic Japanese yokai. The ones that we're fighting now are like vampires and walking suits of armor and skeletons, traditionally more Western looking monsters. It feels like this game kind of almost has a subtext of cultural imperialism and maybe even a little bit of cultural appropriation. Like, this whole game is about how Japan is slowly getting taken over by Western influence, and it's up to, your Japanese hero to go and fight off this Western influence to protect, your culture or whatever. Again, I might be overanalyzing this a little bit, but thinking back to it, a couple of those Gomon games I played were like that as well. When I sat down to play Pocky and Rocky, I wasn't exactly expecting some sort of political, cultural commentary or anything. I might be overanalyzing this, like I said, but it just kind of struck me as weird. Plot to this game might be actually deeper than they initially made it seem. Overall, the plot to this game is, decent. It's a shooter, so, you don't need much of it. If Twin Bee was the cute-em-up equivalent of, say, Xevious, and Fantasy Zone was the cute-em-up equivalent of, say, Gradius, Pocky and Rocky would probably be the cute-em-up equivalent of, well, Shock Troopers of all things, which is awesome. It's a top-down shooter that's kind of like Ikari Warriors, but it has a melee system, although in this case it's not contextual, but more mapped to a separate button. Your job is to get from one side of the stage to the other, all while plowing through numerous monsters that try and get in your way. You have a couple of different abilities to your character. You have the ability to throw cards, or if you're playing as Rocky, leaves. You have a magic stick. Rocky has his tail, as well as a dash system to get out of trouble real quick, although you lose a lot of control once you start dashing. You really have to commit to those dashes, as well as a bomb, and that's kind of your lot. It's not a complicated system, but it works very, very well. The cards are very effective to damage enemies, and your magic stick or tail are utilized expertly as a shield. Bear in mind, this is not omnidirectional. You have to be focusing on what's coming your way, and it will only deflect bullets. But still, it's an important tool in your kit in order to complete these levels, to be able to actually defend yourself. And I find it quite impressive that this game managed to give you both an offensive and defensive option. You can use your tail and stick to ultimately attack enemies as well if they get close, but it's not really recommended because it doesn't do a lot of damage even though it hits very, very quickly. And it's also worth noting Pocky and Rocky are actually not identical characters. They actually do play slightly differently. I didn't play as Rocky too much, but from what I recall he was slightly slower and has a slightly bigger bomb, if I recall correctly. Again, I didn't play as him too much. I kind of just stuck to Pocky for the more general experience because I wanted to try and get through the game without having to master two different characters. And this game is hard. It's very incredibly difficult. There are several power-ups you can pick up along the way. Food that will heal you, a green orb that will give you an extra bomb. There is a shield that will protect you from 2 hits. You can also get fire card power-ups as well as black card power-ups. The fire ones make your cards fiery, and I think they do slightly more damage. The black card power-ups give you a spread shot, and if you collect multiple of the same power-up, you'll upgrade them. Unfortunately, if you grab one of the opposite ones, it automatically swaps you over and downgrades your other one, which is kind of crap because I really like the spread shot, and the random weapon drops sometimes just dropped a flame power-up into my lap and got rid of my super spread. That really kind of sucks. There's also not really a power-up per se, but the lucky gods make cameos in this game as well. They're usually hidden in the environments or require you to do certain feats, but if you do, they will drop a mass of power-ups on you. So it's worth seeking them out for sure. While there are only 6 stages, they are very, very long, especially the final stage. That could have probably been broken up into 3 separate stages on its own, because when you get a game over, you go all the way back to the start. Seriously, the final stage is a bit of a gauntlet, but it is a true final challenge for you. Same with the final boss. As you go through the stages, you'll encounter various enemies, monsters, as well as mini-bosses, and I do appreciate that they try and give you a little bit of story with each monster you run into. All the mini-bosses and bosses like to taunt you and give you a little bit of a backstory before you move on. It's genuinely a nice little bit of characterization for all the enemies you're kind of mowing down. And the fact that every area has its own unique monsters that are usually area specific is quite impressive. For example, the second area has a river, and that river is pretty much the only place you'll ever run into kappas. They'll hop off their little ledge on the riverbank, hop on your boat, and try and drag you into the water, and that is genuinely terrifying, but you'll never see them anywhere else. They really thought about where these monsters are going to be placed and how they should react to characters. It's really well thought out. And did I mention this game is hard? Because it is very, very hard. There is a difficulty option, and I'm not gonna lie, once I got to level 4, I had to crank it down to easy, but the difficulty doesn't really affect the game like you might think. Basically, when you go to an easier difficulty, all you get is an extra life and bomb for your continue. And that's it. It doesn't change enemy aggression or patterns or attack types. They're all the same enemies. They're going to be in the same place and stuff. I mean, on a base level, that does make the game easier, but, if I said it's easy, maybe a few less enemies, just to get my feet wet and get a little bit more practice into the game before it completely stomps me into the dirt, because, yeah, this game, it's a tiny bit hard. And by a tiny bit hard, I mean it is incredibly hard. It's definitely a shooter from the 90s with roots in a shooter from the 80s. As cute as it is, it does not pull its punches. But overall, while Pocky and Rocky isn't necessarily the longest game, it's quite a nuanced little shooter. You've got tons of abilities, you've got a defensive option, you've got offensive options, and you've got a wide variety of enemies that attack you in very different ways. They do have a tendency of swarming you, which is a bit stressful, especially early on, but once you get used to it, and you play through each stage a few times, you really do get a feel for it, and it becomes a lot easier. The first time I ended up running into, the second stage, I was swarmed with enemies and I was just panicking as to what to do, and then, a few more times down that stage, I was like, I got these guys, no problem. It gets easier the more you practice it. It's certainly not the hardest game ever, but it will certainly beat you down with its difficulty, at least the first few times you play it. Especially that final boss, after that gauntlet of a stage. The ending of this, it's definitely a trial, but it's definitely a satisfying game to play. Gameplay-wise, huge thumbs up to Pocky and Rocky. Now, the overall presentation to Pocky and Rocky is excellent. Visuals are beautiful. The game is very detailed and full of personality. Like I said, there's tons of different enemies that are sort of dotted around the maps in places that kind of make sense for their specific type of creature. You know, you run into like cloud monsters on the top of mountains and stuff, you run into kappas by the river. They really did think about what the environments would be like and where they would place their characters. It was a well thought out execution, and it makes this world feel a lot more believable and alive. I think visually speaking, Pocky and Rocky is absolutely a stunner. And audio-wise, the soundtrack is absolutely great. I quite like the interstitial music. The music to the stages themselves is great. It's silly, but I'm not gonna lie, my favorite thing about this game audio-wise is on the title screen, they actually used the original game's theme song as like a remix for the title screen, which I thought was just such a cute little touch that's probably the one thing that sticks with me the best. But let me tell you, the soundtrack of this game is great. Overall, the presentation to Pocky and Rocky is excellent, and I think that's important. It is a cute 'em up. It needs to have the personality and the color and the style, and it absolutely nails it. Now, if you want a copy of Pocky and Rocky on the Super Nintendo, cheapest one I'm seeing right now is, oh my god, how much? This game is like $300. You can get a Japanese version for about $150, but that's still a lot. I'm not going to tell you this game is not worth it, because it's a damn good game, but I will say that is an awful lot for a single shooter. If you're into shmups, if you're into interesting shooters, I think this one's definitely worth picking up, but only if that's within your budget. Which is a shame, because I think this is a necessary staple for pretty much any Super Nintendo collection, really. Especially if you've got sort of a fondness for the Japanese aesthetic and the whole yokai thing that this game has going on. Definitely a big fan of that. And I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to the patron saint of all awesome mecha things, JetWolf68K, for including this in his box of awesome. This game I have been looking forward to for a very long time. I've been trying to get this pretty much since I was a kid. I am glad I finally got a chance to play it. And, you know, this game did get a sequel. In fact, it got two. It got Pocky and Rocky 2, also on the Super Nintendo. It got a Game Boy Advance sequel as well, known as Pocky and Rocky with Becky. And, you know, if the whole $300 price tag is a bit much for you, don't worry. It's actually getting remade right now. It's coming out in a few months when I record this, and I believe it's going to be called Pocky and Rocky Reshrined. And it's supposed to come out December 2021, and I gotta tell you, from what I'm seeing about it, it looks awesome. I think I'm going to have to get a copy of this myself, but it looks like Pocky and Rocky, only they hand drew everything. So it's a little less colorful, but it's got a little bit more detail. I think both have their merits, and I'm glad I have this. I might have to try and get that one as well. But again, huge shout out and thank you to JetWolf for allowing me to play this game, a game I've wanted to play for a very, very long time. And I think you should play it as well. If you like Super Nintendo games, if you like shooters, if you like shmups, if you like cute shooters, which, let's just be honest, we all do, they're great, I think this is kind of a must-have. It's a bit pricey for a Super Nintendo copy, but I will say, having played it, if you can afford it and it's totally within your budget, it's well worth it. But you might just want to wait for the remake, or, you know, look into reproductions.